Merry Christmas, everybody. Once again, Merry Christmas. Welcome back to the Hoplite channel. I am your host, Hop. Of course, you knew that. Welcome back. We are here, and you clicked on this video to see part 2 of Sun Tzu's Art of War. That is correct. Yeah, so now we are moving into the second part for this 3-part series on the Art of War. If you're coming here after watching part 1, thanks a lot. If you haven't watched part 1, I recommend you go back and watch that before watching part 2. But nevertheless, you're here. And yeah, we're going to jump into the readings for Art of War, as I have it right here in Ralph Sawyer's translation. Yep, this book, as I said in part 1, it's one of those pieces of literature you really have to read more than once if you intend to gain all the knowledge that is contained within the pages. It really is that good. And as I said, it's not really that long at all. You can get through it in a day or two, even if you take your time. But yeah, before we jump into part 2, for the readings rather, let's get into a little bit more backstory regarding Sun Tzu and his famous work. So as I said for the initial part to this series, Sun Tzu lived in the spring and autumn period of the Zhou Kingdom. And this would have been 771 to 476 BC. So it's a pretty good length of years right there. But we know that Sun Tzu died around 496 BC. And the period that followed was known as the period of the Warring States. Yeah, so not as nice sounding as spring and autumn period at all. So the Warring States period in China occurred when the different principalities and I guess you would say the different kings within the Chinese territory were vying for control of China, hoping to become emperors. But during the spring and autumn period, the tactics and the strategies that were espoused in Art of War were considered very unorthodox and unnatural in this age. This age in the spring and autumn period and the periods prior were very orthodox. They still subscribed to a very strict code of chivalry, and there were things you didn't do on the battlefield or in the administration of war that Sun Tzu advised generals to take upon as a different philosophy altogether. Yeah, so what you had was a stalemate between these warring states, and because they were always engaging each other under the same rules, using the same principles of chivalry, rarely did any one side seek, or actually they sought the advantage, but they never really attained it because they were within this strict set of rules and protocol for war, which Sun Tzu turned on its head. And one gentleman in particular, Ying Sheng, who was the king of Qin, however you say it, he actually read Art of War and adopted Sun Tzu's tactics. So he understood that the warring states were having this stalemate recur throughout the years. And because of the stalemate, he grew frustrated and thought, well, how do we break this stagnation, and how do we actually get beyond the ability to, how do we create for ourselves the ability to win on the battlefield and not have to face these skirmishes, which rarely result in anyone getting the advantage. And he thought that Sun Tzu was onto something with Art of War. He read it, he understood it, and he implemented it. And as a consequence of that, he conquered the other states. And this established the Qin Dynasty, which lasted 221 through 206 BC, which is not a long time, but it was a dynasty nonetheless, and Ying Sheng became an emperor as a result. So because of this constant back and forth between the states and this stalemate, Ying Sheng saw an opportunity, and he saw Sun Tzu's Art of War and the methods it prescribed as the means of breaking that stalemate, of taking war into a new direction and using the tactics and the strategies that he espoused, he was able to find victory where others were not. And Ying Sheng, because of Sun Tzu, became emperor. So we know in the period that followed Sun Tzu, the warring states, his treatise, Art of War, was put to the test, and it was a success, without a doubt. Okay, and I also mentioned in part one the story of the King of Wu and his concubine army. And this is kind of entertaining, but it's a legend in the lesson it taught, and you could almost believe that it's made up because it almost sounds too far-fetched. But according to the historical sources, this in fact happened. And the story goes that the King of Wu wanted to hire or bring on Sun Tzu as his general and to command his armies. But he didn't know anything about Sun Tzu beyond the stories that were told about him, about his reputation, about his achievements, and he wanted to test the mettle of the man himself. So what he did was he invited Sun Tzu to his court, and he set up a little exercise for him. And he called out his harem of concubines, his sex slaves, as it were. And he spoke to Sun Tzu and said, "I hear you are the most famous general in all of China, and I would like you to lead my armies into battle. But I don't really know how good of a general you are, but I'd like to see it for myself. And I figure if you're able to get an army of concubines to do what you need done, well then surely a professional army will carry out your orders and seek victory on the battlefield, because you've demonstrated that with an army of prostitutes that you know what you're doing." And the King of Wu, I think, thought this would be amusing. So Sun Tzu looked at the king and he said, "All right, sure. I will demonstrate how I intend to be a general for you, and I will carry out your orders as you wish." So what he did was he talked to his advisors, and he walked down to where the harem was, the concubine army, and he picked out the two favorite concubines of King Wu. And he said, "You will be my company commanders, follow me." And they followed him, and he divided the harem into two companies. And he put concubine A in charge of one side and concubine B in charge of the other. And he addressed the two concubines and said, "Officers, have your armies face right." And they looked at each other and kind of smiled, and then they turned back to their companies and said, "Face right." And all the concubines just giggled and they laughed and thought it was really amusing and cute. And Sun Tzu had this stone face looking at them, and he said, "If the general gives the order and the order is not understood, the general is at fault. If the general gives the order and the order is understood but not carried out, the officers are at fault." And so he said to the two company commanders, "Do you understand the order?" And they nodded and smiled and giggled. And he said, "Commanders, have your armies face right." The two concubines turned around again, and they told their armies to face right. And just like the first time, all the concubines giggled and laughed. They thought it was amusing that they were being given orders by a general. So the general looked to his advisors, and he said, "The order has been given and understood, and the officers have failed to carry it out. Execute the officers." And at this point, the King of Wu jumped up and he said, "No, not Tiffany and Nikki. Anyone but them, please. I beg of you." And Wu looked at the king and he said, "Yeah, Tiffany and Nikki, they got to go." And they got the axe right in front of everybody. And so, Tiffany and Nikki's bodies are flopping around doing the funky chicken. And he steps over them and he goes down to the two companies and he grabs the next two favorite concubines of King Wu. And he says, "You are now my company commanders." And he brought them up to the front and he said, "If the order is given but not understood, the general is at fault. If the order is given and understood but not carried out, the officers are at fault. Do you understand?" And they just looked at him, scared out of their wits. And he said, officers, have your armies face right." They turned around and they said, "Companies face right." And without hesitation and without failure, every single concubine in those armies turned and faced right. And for the remainder of the day, every order Sun Tzu gave to the concubine commanders, the concubine armies carried out without hesitation and without failure. And this was Sun Tzu telling King Wu, "Yeah, you thought this exercise was pretty cute. I can imagine you guys got a laugh out of this when you came up with it. But I showed you two things. Number one, when you give me an order, I am going to carry out that order, and nothing is going to stop me, because that's my job as a general. And number two, even if you attempt to interfere with that order and protest, I will still carry it out. So don't ever set me in motion and give me a task and then later come to me and say, I don't want you to carry out that motion. I don't want you to finish that task. Because once the order is given, you can consider it as good as done." So King of Wu, with egg on his face and with two dead concubines, said, "All right, understood." Sun Tzu became his general, according to the legend, because of that story, and won fame thereafter. Okay, so that was the story of King Wu and the concubine army, and the legend of Sun Tzu in the court of King Wu. All right, I'm assuming their names were Nikki and Tiffany. So yeah, let's jump into more Art of War readings here, and we'll talk as we always do, and I will put the go-bys for you to follow as I read. And we jump to chapter 4, military disposition. Sun Tzu said, "Thus, one who excels at warfare first establishes himself in a position where he cannot be defeated while not losing any opportunity to defeat the enemy. For this reason, the victorious army first realizes the conditions for victory and then seeks to engage in battle. The vanquished army fights first and then seeks victory. One who excels at employing the military cultivates the Tao and preserves the laws. Therefore, he is able to be the regulator of victory and defeat." Okay, so this is a very famous quote, if you're familiar with any of the quotes of Sun Tzu, that all battles that are fought are won or lost before the fighting even begins. And that is because someone who excels at warfare establishes himself in a position where he cannot be defeated while not losing any opportunity to defeat the enemy. So he is always putting himself in a defensive position even when he is on the offensive. He is putting himself in an offensive position even when it appears as though he's moving to a defensive position. This is good tactics, right? It is the same as a swordsman who always keeps his guard up with his shield arm but maintains the swinging arm of his sword, right? He is still guarding against attack, but he is attacking as he guards. This is someone who excels at warfare because they understand that just because they are on the attack does not mean in an instant he could be on the defensive, so he must prepare for both. And because of that, he is able to regulate victory and defeat. Okay, let's move on to this chapter. I'm sorry, the same chapter, paragraph below. He says, the 5 steps. As for military methods, the first is termed measurement. The second, estimation of forces. The third, calculation of numbers of men. The fourth, weighing relative strength. And the fifth, victory. Okay, so yeah, he's saying that for your military methods, you have to move along with these 5 steps if you intend to achieve victory. And that's measurement, which is essentially the first step you must take in any military engagement, is you must measure the forces. Second, you must estimate the forces, as in what is the estimation of what you have in comparison to your opponent. The third is the calculation of numbers, which is just raw, like what number do I have in my ranks versus my opponents. The fourth is weighing the relative strength, and the fifth is victory. So you could say these 5 steps are all essentially measurements. You're measuring where you would have to put your army versus the other army as far as distance. The estimation would be the numbers, the calculation of the numbers, and the weighing of the relative strength. So everything is put upon a balance. Everything is a measurement of A versus B, of 1 versus 2. of many versus few, of strong versus weak. And without estimating these calculations and taking these measurements, you cannot reach the fifth step, which is victory. But as long as you take all of the calculations and measurements into your overall accounting, you will have victory. Okay, last paragraph for this chapter. Sun Tzu said, "Thus the victorious army is like a ton compared with an ounce, while the defeated army is like an ounce weighed against a ton. The combat of the victorious is like the sudden release of a pent-up torrent down 1,000-fathom gorge. This is the strategic disposition of force," or sing. Okay, so as he's said in the previous paragraph, with these estimations you make, measurement, calculation, weighing, estimated forces, you essentially are making these estimations because when you release your forces against the enemy force, it will be as though it is a torrent or a stream flowing down a gorge, and as it reaches the bottom of this gorge, the force that is unleashed because of your calculations will be as though a ton is coming up against an ounce, and that your enemy would be as though they are an ounce trying to fight against a ton. Because of the calculations you've made, the differences in weight will be so overwhelming, it will be as though a deluge coming down a waterfall. Okay, let's move to chapter 5 now. And this is under the heading Strategic Military Power. And Sun Tzu said, "What enables the masses of the three armies invariably to withstand the enemy without being defeated are the unorthodox, the Qi, and the orthodox, the Cheng. In general, in battle one engages with the orthodox and gains victory through the unorthodox. Thus, one who excels at sending forth the unorthodox is as inexhaustible as heaven, as unlimited as the Yangtze and Yellow rivers. What reach and end and beginning again are the sun and moon. What die and are reborn are the four seasons." Okay, we're getting a little philosophical now. As I said, he gets pretty straightforward in some paragraphs, and in others he talks about the sun and moon and the Yangtze and the seasons and being reborn. But what he essentially means is that in battle you have to be concerned with two different variables, and that would be the Qi and the Cheng. And the Qi being the unorthodox, which is the life force, right? The Qi, and Cheng being the orthodox, which would be the corporeal movement of troops against troops, horses against horses, arms against arms. But the unorthodox is the Qi. This is the strategy. This is up here. So you move your orthodox, your Cheng, into position, but if you send forth the unorthodox, this is inexhaustible. Meaning as long as you have the life force, the Qi, the will to win, it is unlimited, like the Yangtze and the Yellow rivers. And what reach and end and begin again are the sun and moon, and what die are reborn are the four seasons. It is the evolution of the seasons. It is the rising and the setting of the sun. This is the unorthodox. This is the Qi. This is something I think when he mentions in the first part, he attributes to heaven. The Qi, the life force, is everything that all life forms possess. If you want to look at a good example in the modern sense of the Force, as we in the Star Wars universe. But the Qi is this force that exists on the battlefield and in all souls, but it is something that is inexhaustible because it can reanimate itself, and it can ebb and flow like the tides, and it can rise and set like the sun. But you must know both of these two methods, the orthodox and the unorthodox, if you intend to be successful. Okay, and we'll move to the paragraph below on page 187. "The notes do not exceed 5, but the changes of the 5 notes can never be fully heard. The colors do not exceed 5, but the changes of the 5 colors can never be completely seen. The flavors do not exceed 5, but the changes of the 5 flavors can never be completely tasted. In warfare, the strategic configurations of power, or Shi, do not exceed the unorthodox and orthodox, but the changes of the unorthodox and the orthodox can never be completely exhausted. The unorthodox and the orthodox mutually produce each other, just like an endless cycle. Who can exhaust them? All right, so more philosophy here. So he's talking about the primary colors. He's talking about the 5 notes in music. He's talking about the 5 flavors that we taste, be it sweet, salty, acrid, etc. So what he's trying to convey to the reader is within these parameters, which be the orthodox, the 5 notes, the 5 flavors, right, the 5 primary colors, you cannot exceed beyond them. But it's the varying shades in between, the varying flavors between the 5 flavors, the colors between the 5, the music you can make with 5 notes is seemingly endless. This is how you must approach the orthodox and the unorthodox. You must understand the limits in which you are bound, but you must also understand in between those limits there is unlimited opportunity. And this is the configurations of power, of Shi. And you must seek victory within those unlimited flavors, unlimited notes, the unseen colors that exist among the 5 orthodox known. It's pretty deep, but I think that's what he means. Okay, and on the bottom of 1A7, continuing on, the strategic configuration of power, Shi, of those that excel in warfare is sharply focused. Their constraints are precise. Their strategic configurations of power is like a fully drawn crossbow. Their constraints like the release of the trigger. Okay, so now he's using the analogy of a crossbow and a trigger. And he's saying that the configuration of power, which is Shi, and for those that excel, it's sharply focused, which means they have constraints, but within these constraints, there is this pent-up energy, and it is precise. And like the torrent coming down the waterfall and hitting the rocks below, it just needs that moment of release. And the moment of release, like the fully drawn crossbow, is the trigger. And once the power is captured within that crossbow and it's under tension, all that has to take it off tension is that sharp release of the trigger. And that is the Shi, that is the configuration of power that you have developed between the 5 notes, the 5 flavors, the 5 colors, and you've come up with the formula. It is under pressure, it is ready to pop, and then when it is released, it comes out like 10,000 pounds per square inch. Okay, next we move to, what chapter are we on here? This would be chapter 7. Simply titled Military Combat. Sun Tzu said, "Thus the army is established by deceit, moves for advantage and changes through segmenting and reuniting. Thus its speed is like the wind, its slowness like the forest, its invasion and plundering like a fire. Unmoving it is like the mountains. It is as difficult to know as the darkness. In movement it is like thunder." All right, that one's pretty cool. So what he's saying here is that the unorthodox and the orthodox, your army becomes like forces of nature, right? It is fast, it is slow, it is like the wind, it is like the mountains. It plunders like fire, but it also is stagnant, right? Like the forest. But you can't decipher what it is because it is unknown. It is as impenetrable as the darkness, but it moves like thunder. So your army, as you configure it within the Shi, the configurations of power, within those 5 notes, it is like orchestrating a piece of music. Within those 5 notes or flavors or colors, you are determining how you will move your army against your opposing force. And because you have read your opponent correctly and you know your own capabilities, because of your excellence with configuring power as Shi, you can establish your army to move like the wind, but it can also be as slow and still as a forest. It could be as immovable as a mountain, and it could rage and plunder like a fire, and it could be impenetrable and unknown as the darkness is, or move like thunder. Yeah, so be formless, but have shape. Be fast, but move slowly. Again, this is almost getting into that Zen Buddhism territory, but I think this is the lesson he's trying to say, is that Your army must be like a force of nature, but it must be able to move from one force of nature to the other, be it a hurricane or an earthquake or what have you. Okay, and on the bottom of page 198, continuing on, Sun Tzu said, "The qi of the three armies can be snatched away. The commanding general's mind can be seized. For this reason, in the morning, their qi is ardent. During the day, their qi becomes indolent. At dusk, their qi is exhausted. Thus, one who excels at employing the army avoids their ardent qi and strikes when it is indolent or exhausted. This is the way to manipulate qi." Okay. So what he's saying here is that this is where the people that have any kind of gripe or complaint with Sun Tzu is that he has several passages that refer to this qi, which is the life force. This is the essence. And they think it's rather superstitious, which it is. But there could be some validity to it, because he believes that if you attack an army in the morning, their qi is probably at its strongest. It is at its most dangerous, because after a long night of sleeping, they are fully rested. In the middle of the day, they're not as well rested as they were in the morning, and they're not as tired as they are in the evening. They're kind of in the middle. They're 50-50. And at night, before dusk, they're getting tired. Maybe they had a long day. Maybe they marched for miles or had little food, and they just want to turn in and go to bed. This is where their qi is starting to wane, and it will wax again in the morning. So he believes that because of these fluctuations in the day, people and armies' qi will also fluctuate. That's up to debate. I mean, some people would say in the morning, maybe if the conditions aren't as great, people's qi would be low if it's raining in the morning. But by the midday, if the sun comes out and it warms up, this could lift their qi. It's, again, up to debate. But he is trying to say that qi has cycles in mankind and in armies, just as the day has different levels and migrations of the sun from rising to setting. Okay, and on 199, continuing on that topic of qi, Sun Tzu wrote, "With the near await the distance, with the rested await the fatigued, with the sated await the hungry. This is the way to control strength. Do not intercept well-ordered flags. Do not attack well-regulated formations. This is the way to control changes. Do not swallow an army acting as bait. Do not obstruct an enemy retreating homeward. If you besiege an army, you must leave an outlet. Do not press an exhausted invader." Okay, so he's giving some advice, but a warning at the same time as regards to qi. He's saying that if your qi is starting to wax, then you should prepare for an attack, especially if your opponent's qi is starting to wane. If they're hungry and you are sated, attack. If they're exhausted and you are rested, attack. But by the inverse, if you attack and if you press too hard because of this circumstance, your enemy could have its qi invigorated, and it could switch to survival mode. As in, if my enemy was attacked because they were exhausted and I was rested, I can press them. But if they're retreating to go homeward and I still pursue, I am not giving them much of an option anymore. Because if they retreat and they can lick their wounds and live to fight another day, well, they will just continue on moving homeward. But if I press and I try to destroy them before they have an outlet to get to safety, well, then I could invigorate their spirit to fight now for survival and not just for victory. And this is dangerous, because anyone who will tell you a cornered animal is the most dangerous kind of animal, because without a place to go, without an option of flight, you just removed every option it has except for one, and that is fight. And if fighting means surviving, well, now you've got an enemy who perhaps is twice as strong as the one you encountered, twice as strong as the one that was just turning its tail, hopefully trying to get away from your attack. Always let a cornered enemy have one escape route. And by doing so, you will avoid getting into a battle with an enemy that now has a new purpose, and that is not just to win a victory, but to win back their life. Again, cornered animal, the most dangerous kind. All right, and let's move now to the last reading. And this is chapter 8 under the 9 changes, 204. And Sun Tzu said, "Thus generals have 5 dangerous character traits. One committed to dying can be slain. One committed to living can be captured. One easily angered and hasty to act can be insulted. One obsessed with being scrupulous and untainted can be shamed. One who loves the people can be troubled." Now these 5 dangerous traits are excesses in a general, potential disaster for employing the army. The army's destruction and the general's death will invariably stem from these 5, so they must be investigated. Okay, yeah, so here he's giving a warning to anyone who would be a general, who would look to employ an army and seek victory. These are the 5 things you must look out for if you are in charge, as he was, of a king's army. One committed to dying can be slain, right? So if one simply seeks to live and die on the battlefield, well, he has already demonstrated to you what he is willing to go through. So you can commit this general to sacrificing his own life and to disregarding preservation, because if he's willing to die and is eager for it, well, then you can easily grant his wish and bait him into a situation where he will give up that life. The inverse, a general committed to living can be captured, meaning that you could set something in motion where the general, because he wants to preserve his life at all costs, is willing to be captured and perhaps ransomed at a later date. The general that's willing to be captured, he is just as vulnerable as the general who's willing to die for anything and everything. And next, one who is easily angered and hasty can be insulted. When I hear this, I think about another very Machiavellian Sun Tzu movie, The Godfather. Michael Corleone becomes the Don after Don Corleone hands the family business down to him. But his older brother, Sonny, was just by virtue of his birth next in line. But Sonny gets killed. And throughout the whole movie, you can see that Sonny is someone who is easily insulted and hasty. He makes rash decisions. He is quick to anger. And his enemies actually take advantage of that. In that his sister Connie was getting beaten up by her husband. And instead of waiting and instead of formulating a plan, he is insulted by what happened to his sister, and he is quick to anger, and he leaves without any protection, without his bodyguards to look after him, and he gets caught in that causeway, and he just gets, Tommy gunned and shot up and killed. And that was a trap they had laid for him, because they knew he was hot-headed, they knew he was hasty, and they knew eventually it would get the better of him, and he would leave himself open to assassination, which is what happened. So yeah, don't be Sonny Corleone. Don't be hasty, and just put away these insults, because oftentimes people are using these insults, especially if you're in a position of power, to goad you and to get you into committing to something that you normally wouldn't do if you had a level head about you. And then similarly to the one who is hasty and can be insulted, one obsessed with being scrupulous and untainted can be shamed. This is speaking to the neat freak, or someone who has to have everything just right, or someone who meticulously plans something, but when it goes down the drain, they're shamed because their plans have been tainted. They can be insulted just as easily as someone who is hasty. So if your plans are scrupulous, don't be so committed to them where that you cannot function if plan A goes out the window and you have to implement plan B. Because someone who is this strict or orthodox in their technique, in their plans, if they cannot give up that rigidity, they will possibly go down with it as well. And lastly, one who loves the people can be troubled. Right, so Sun Tzu is saying to the general, you might love your country and you love your people, but you must never let that love get in the way of the mission you have to carry out. If the love of your people is first and foremost in your mind, that's not necessarily a hindrance unless you allow it to become one. And if the love of your people keeps you from possibly sacrificing troops where they might need to be sacrificed, or possibly giving up parts of your territory and surrendering parts of your territory to the enemy, and thereby putting your people at significant risk. If those are too much for you to live with, then you need to watch out, because if your enemies learn that about you, they can also use it against you. And that is the last of the 5 dangers for all generals. So says Sun Tzu. Okay, that will conclude part 2 of Art of War. Yep, this reading hopefully didn't go as long as last time, but it may have. Again, I hope you're enjoying this 3-part series I put together just before the Christmas season. We'll come back here and round it out with part 3, and we'll do the last few selected readings from Art of War. Again, I hope you're having a very holly jolly Merry Christmas season so far, and we will see you back here for part 3. Till then, Merry Christmas and take it easy.